Great to be here for participating as part of this conference on free speech in the left. We've got a great panel here. So myself, I'm Johan, sorry to say great myself, but anyway, myself, I'm moderating this panel, and also a journalist covering cartels and corruption. I'm based in Mexico City. I've been here for 22 years, author of 3 books. We've got Luis Chaparro, who is a fantastic journalist originally from Ciudad Juarez. He grew up there with all of the crazy violence when it was the most murderous city in the world. He was beginning his journalistic career, and he's still been at it. One of the kind of hardcore few Mexican journalists really going deep into the cartel stuff, Sinaloa, all over the country and on the US side as well. And then Catherine Corcoran, who was the bureau chief for AP in Mexico City for many years, is author of this fantastic book on investigating the murder, one of the most high-profile murder cases of a Mexican journalist, Regina Martinez, In the Mouth of the Wolf. Very, very great book there. So yeah, that's a very, very short bio. If anything else you want to add in, but just to get the thing rolling, so we want to talk now about free speech. Is obviously a big issue that people are discussing in the United States, in the UK, in various countries. In Mexico, it's a whole different level of threats to free speech, and the issue of organized crime, cartel violence, which is not only Mexico, it's also the United States, it's also Europe, it's also global. So just to get the ball rolling and starting off, Luis, so in Mexico itself, people have already seen this on the news. You've had, more than 150 journalists who have been murdered in Mexico in the last 20 or so years. Most of the cases are unsolved, but the presumption of cartels, organized crime being involved in a large number of those, often with corrupt officials. So first of all, Luis, to start off, you grew up doing this. You grew up getting into journalism when it was already extremely violent. A guy being murdered on his lunch break in Ciudad Juarez for the newspaper. What kind of motivated you, despite that, to do it anyway, to kind of make a career of not only doing journalism, but doing narco journalism in Mexico?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the kind introduction, Johan. Great to see you here, and great to see Catherine as well here. I feel honored to be with 2 of the guys that I grew up reading, your stuff. So really glad to be here. And well, I think I started off because, yes, I was literally graduating college when Ciudad Juarez was labeled the most dangerous city in the world. This was something that I was watching brew as I was growing older. But then there was this case that really affected me personally and launched me into this, we could call it probably rabbit hole of finding what happened and why. And those questions, probably over 15 years later, I can still find the answers. I think the answers are way more complicated and complex than just a single answer. But what happened is, by the time I was still in college, I was working as a correspondent for FNU's agency, which is a news service in Spanish, covering Ciudad Juarez and the border. And then my editor at one night, like very late in the night, I think it probably was like 1 a.m, he called me and said that there was a multiple murder at a bar that was actually not far from where I was living back then in Ciudad Juarez. He asked me if I could go there, meet a photographer who was already at scene, and try to write a short piece for like a hit for that same night, and probably a follow-up on the next morning. So I drove my my motorcycle. I used to have a motorcycle. Showed up to this bar, and the 5 young guys killed at this bar were all of my friends. that really affected me personally. That was something that first threw me into the question of what happened. Of course, I had to call my editor and say, like, you know what, I can't write about this story. These guys are my friends. I was supposed to be here that night with them. And that launched me into finding and researching and interviewing people and trying to find the better source, the best source, someone who was closer to what happened that night and why were my friends killed. I know personally that none of them were involved in any like drug selling or, you know, that kind of stuff. But even if they were, I was like, but why? Why kill them like that in a bar and under these crazy situations? So I think that was my personal question to answer, and trying to find something broader that was like what's happening to my city and how my city is becoming the epicenter of a war that is exporting to the whole country and probably to the whole region. And that was literally why I started doing this, and still can't find answers. I probably have more questions now than I had back then. I had one question and I have 1,000 other questions, but yeah, that was really my motivation to jump into this world of reporting under the narco beat.
That's quite a story. I've known you, Luis, for some years, and I didn't know that story. That's quite something, and quite a way into journalism. So now, Catherine, you know, so Catherine ran the AP. Remind us exactly the years you ran the AP bureau. You know, running the AP bureau during a period of intense violence against journalists in Mexico, and also for people who aren't aware of what running an AP bureau is like, it means you're not only managing the staff in the office, which means both American, foreign, and Mexican staff. You're also managing stringers and people around the country, many people in danger, making decisions about their risk. And then going from that to writing this book about a particular murder of a journalist. So what was your kind of story and experience there?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the invite too. And Yoan, you can definitely include yourself in the term great journalist. I've admired your work for a long time. And Luis, also, I often feel like, oh, I'm just writing about it. You're the person doing it and living it. And you're very brave for that. I guess coming from the United States, because when I came from the United States to Mexico, the environment in the United States for reporting was very different. And I was already well into my career, and I had a career where, and I was very much aware that compared to around the world, that we had a quote, a pretty easy job in terms of, you know, getting public records, doing investigations, not getting threatened, not our lives not being threatened for the most part. Obviously, you know, we could be sued and things like that. But so I think that's why it struck me what Mexican journalists are up against to do basically the same job we were doing with very little resistance. And I just wanted to show that. After, first of all, managing, as you mentioned, a diverse group of journalists, many of them Mexican, and having all the considerations of their protection. I like to point out that the international journalists aren't targeted like Mexican journalists. We didn't operate that way. We had to think about the safety of everyone, but we knew that especially our stringers and collaborators who were working in their home communities, that the situation was very dangerous for them. And one of the things that was interesting is that the journalists like working for organizations like the AP, and Luis, you were at the FA, because it was a way to get the information out. It was a way to get the information that maybe if they published locally would be too dangerous, to get it out. And I thought that was also very dedicated of these journalists to say, I don't care if if you have to take my byline off for safety, I just want the information out there. And so observing this whole dynamic and just the extreme danger, I thought this is a story that the rest of the world needs to know. And the other aspect, I think, is much, I don't know if it's more well known now, but at the time, as you mentioned, Yoan, everyone said, oh, the narcos are killing journalists. And in a lot of cases, I think at least more than half, that's not true. It's corrupt officials, politicians who don't want to be exposed as being part of this criminal network. And so that was something also sort of a myth that I wanted to dispel, because there has been, last year, Mexico had a record. It was the worst year for journalist killings. And so there was a little bit of resonance in the US. People were sort of, when I would bring up my subject, just in random, they'd go, oh yeah, the narcos are killing journalists. And so I would say, no, it's not the narcos. I mean, clearly in some cases. So I think I just wanted to tell the story of bravery against all odds, and just expose exactly who it is. It's the very people who were elected to protect and to uphold the free speech that is written into the Mexican Constitution who are the perpetrators of these crimes.
Right. Yeah. So, a very, very tough thing. We're talking about then, so the kind of two things, that the narcos and the corrupt officials and the corrupt state, and these are entwined and messed up. We're talking about the narcos first, and some of the challenges in covering the drug war. So, I mean, it's very hard to make decisions about how you cover this, how much you should cover violence, how much you should show. Going back to the AP, I worked at the AP for a couple of years in the 2000s, and there was a time we were covering all the time the beheadings. It was a very, very sad day. I remember a message going around the office saying we no longer cover individual beheadings because there's so many. There's no longer news anymore, the individual decapitations, unless it's something very, very big or special or kind of multiple. But it's very, very tough to make choice about how much you should, like portray narco messages, how much you should like portray narco videos. What do you find, Luis, in Juarez, particularly in what's kind of known as the war years, 2008 to 11, when there was a really extreme violence, but carrying on right now? How much do you think, what challenge do you see in covering the narco messages, how much they time it and deliberately are playing with us as the journalists to get their kind of narrative out there?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you said that you guys at the AP also have this kind of like message that let's not cover like a single beheading. So I remember when I was in FA, one of the first things that I kind of like got surprised with was that when you pitched like, hey, they killed, I don't know, like 3-4 men in a single place, whatever, eventually was like, no, that's no news. That's now becoming the norm. That's regular. We need like either if it be like larger numbers or, like someone more important, right? A politician or a known businessman or someone from other country, that kind of stuff. That's literally how the news started operating back then. But yeah, in terms of like narco propaganda, right? Like think cartels in Ciudad Juarez. First, I guess the first propaganda message they sent out was this list of police officers that said, for those who don't believe. That was when the Sinaloa cartel arrived to the city, and they tried to make all of the former Juarez cartel members working for them or just getting away from the turf, right? Like allegedly fighting a turf. So that was the first message, and I think that was not put out there for the police officers to know. I think that was put out there for us journalists to cover that list and us delivering that message to the rival cartel or the police officers that were not on that payroll. The thing why I think it's because of credibility. If they put out that list, if they put out their own channel or whatever, they probably don't have the credibility as journalists. So they were using journalists to send out a credible message. If this gets covered by the news, well, then it is going to get the attention of rivals or the like authorities or whoever we need this message to be sent out to. Then after that, they started putting hits right before the night live cast of all the major channels in Ciudad Juarez. Every major channel, we have like two big channels, TV news outlets in Ciudad Juarez. It was the Canal 56 and the Canal 44. And those newscasts began at 9 p.m. on the clock. So these guys were doing hits 30 minutes, 1 hour before the night newscast of these two channels, with the obvious intention of journalists covering that incident, that hit or that murder or that message, that Naku banner, and put it on when they opened their news, right? We didn't know at the very beginning. Everybody was covering the same kind of stuff. We started learning how to work as a community of journalists and how to communicate with these actors of the drug trafficking organizations. So at the beginning, you wanted to be the first one. You want to have exclusive information. You wanted to be there first. But then sometimes when you arrive first, like myself, I had a motorcycle. So I had the, I was like faster than probably a full band of a TV news outlet. But I found that these guys were still around. And sometimes they will ask you to leave. They will even ask the medical services to leave, to stay away from the murder scene, until it was everything like super set up for the news channel. Then we started figuring out, okay, you know what? Let's not show up first. Let's all show up together. And then we put like groups of journalists that we communicated with each other, and said, mostly through WhatsApp, saying, you know what, we need to go. I'm going to this place. Any of you guys are going? And then some of them will say, yeah, we're going. So we showed up as a group to avoid, being singled out there. Then we started seeing how every time the biggest hits, like when they will kill a businessman or send threats or put out a narco banner or beheadings, was happening right before the night news show started. So we discussed that openly and say, like, you know what, I think these guys are using us or trying to use us to put out their messages. Then one of these groups started a YouTube channel called Quitapuercos. And all of us started covering the Quitapuercos, this YouTube channel online, posting a lot of propaganda by these drug traffickers or criminal organizations. Eventually, we removed our bylines from the newspapers. We removed, for some time, we removed the names of the criminal organizations. We stopped calling the Juarez Cartel or La Línea or the Sinaloa Cartel for a brief, short period of time. And yeah, we literally started discovering that they were using the press for the propaganda benefit of their own. And that was, or could be, a two-way communication between them and us, using the press in the middle. I had completely forgotten about those years and how it has evolved, and how we now have resources and have mechanisms and have proper ways of how to communicate or do these or covering these type of news. But back then we were so confused. It was really hard to do your job when everything you did was basically flipping a coin and seeing what comes after,
There was one incident, I remember going back to 2006 when I was at the AP, and one of the first mass beheadings happened in Michoacán by La Familia Michoacana. And they cut off 5 heads and rolled them into a disco dance floor in Uruapan, Michoacán, and had a big message saying, this is holy justice and stuff. And I remember I was in the AP offices, and the video person said, I'll come and look at this video we just got from the stringer in Uruapan, in Michoacán. And they showed me the video of the 5 heads on the dance floor. And I was like, damn. And, it was like close up, decapitated heads. Then they decided not to put it on the wire for obvious reasons. But I do remember I went back recently for a documentary to try and get it as archive. And it had been sold to a Japanese TV, I think, who went and contacted, we really want this thing. So anyway, I think, Catherine, you were there during some of the most violent years in Mexico. It continues to be extremely violent, but some of the real uptick in violence. If you remind me, what years again, exactly years you were covering? You were the bureau chief?
I was bureau chief from 2010 to 2015. And I started working for the AP in Mexico in 2008.
Yeah, so right during the massive escalation, basically.
Right.
So when these things were happening, and how did you wrestle both the reporter and the bureau chief? I mean, there's other issues as well, like as a foreign correspondent, you know, you get told sometimes, people complaining, oh, why are you making Mexico look bad? Why are you showing all this violence? You know, it's not all bad. You know, why is there more nuance? So how did you wrestle and the kind of struggle with trying to portray the uptick in violence in this period? Obviously, it's a big story of international attention, but it's hard to cover.
I remember the violence, as you both pointed out, it just kept getting bigger and more extreme, and the things that these forces would do just more bizarre. And because it was this rapid like explosion basically, and there wasn't a lot of context for it. And it was new. It was stuff that Mexico had never seen before and the world had never seen before out of Mexico. So of course, when you're an international news agency, that's what they want. I mean, like that's the news. And I think initially that's what we did. We kind of ran from fire to fire. And I remember it was just nonstop. And writing about these stories. And then we would, and you know how this works. Well, you both worked for news agencies, so you know how this works. So then you do these spot news, and then after a couple of days, the editors say, well, tell us what it means. And so we'd have to try to do like an analysis, or what are the forces behind this dramatic increase in violence. And again, it was so new that people didn't really have answers. I mean, some of the analysts did, and they could say, well, this cartel's fighting this cartel, and you know, that kind of thing. But I don't feel like we really had a good handle on explaining why all of a sudden in that moment things exploded. But the explosion was the news. And so that's what we covered. And yes, I always tell the story that my mom would always clip my bylines out of her local paper from the AP, and she would save them for me. And I would go to visit her, and I would look at this little like folder of clippings, and I'd be like, my God, that's all we write about. And it was jarring to me, and another, you know, looking at it and going, oh my God, look at, that's all we write about Mexico. We did try to balance it, but I don't think as much. I mean, like we did the food and the culture and other things, but it was like 24/7 more extreme example of violence. And I think at the time, because it was news, there was no sense of, we're not going to cover this. And I think what gets more complicated over time is when you've seen all of those things and they no longer become news, that sort of fine line between normalizing it by not covering it, but still informing the public. And so I think the way in which you cover this phenomenon has to change. For example, I remember in 2008, everybody was trying to get into the morgue in Ciudad Juarez because we heard that it was just overwhelmed and it was really hard to get in. And one of our reporters talked her way in, and I was the editor on the story. And so we wrote a piece that was, I would say, looking back, fairly graphic about what she saw in the Ciudad Juarez morgue. And she focused on this one unknown beheaded person, and how the forensic people try to figure out who they are and collect the evidence. And that was the story. And I look at that story now and I think, you know, at that time that was news. No, I'm sure you all in Juarez had gotten in, but no new international news agency had gotten in, and it was like a scoop. And so we you know, it was news then. But when I look at that story now, I think if we publish the exact same story today, it would be violence pornography. It would be violence for violence sake, because it did have a context then. Now it would just be for the gruesome details. So I think that's another trick of covering this, because it's been going on so long now, is how do you not ignore the important things, but also not veer into this world of violence for violence sake. I would like to ask you to that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very tough, the balance. I mean, one thing, I mean, I think you can't, as there's a saying in Spanish, you say you can't, use your thumb to cover up the sun. And there was a time, I think, during the Peña Nieto administration, which was 2012 to 2018. There was kind of a big attempt by the Mexican government to try and not talk about drug trafficking, violence and stuff, to kind of make it go away. Changing the narrative was one of the phrases that were floating around the administration. And yeah, then it blows up in their face. Then you get 43 students, teachers, disappeared and then allegedly burned to death, and then we don't even know exactly what happens. And then all this kind of violence coming out back in their face. So it's not only about, this impression, there's a reality on the ground and we have to cover. I mean, it would get, one thing sometimes is trying to make the nuance, to try and say in stories or try and say, actually, like some, Ciudad Juarez at this time or Zacatecas right now is one of the most violent places in the world, but Mexico City is actually less violent, less murderous than Houston, Texas, or Dallas, or even Portland, Oregon right now in terms of the murder rate. And then Yucatan's got the same murder rate as Belgium. But anyway, sticking with you, Catherine, and you've mentioned the political motivation for murders and this merging together. So how do you interpret that? Like, how do you, what do you think are the political motivations? And then maybe in the case of Regina Martinez, which is the case you studied for the book, and that is a politically motivated murder from everything we know. But can you even completely separate the politically motivated murders from the cartel related, because they're kind of meshed together?
Yeah, in fact, whenever I make that point, people say they're one and the same. And they, especially in Veracruz, at the time that Regina was killed, they were the same. The government was running the cartel, and not in a literal sense. Well, in some cases, they did accuse certain officials of running cells of the Zetas, but it was more, they kind of created their own cartel that collaborated, sometimes switched sides. That was one of the reasons for the violence, because they started out with the Zetas and then they went to the Nueva Generación. But they had their own things going on also. They were stealing huge amounts of money. They were vanquishing there was so much impunity. They were vanquishing their own rivals with no consequences. And there's one very extreme story of a prison. One of the state officials who oversaw the state prisons had his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend killed just because he tried to contact her. And it was like so wild, to such extreme, that because he was in that powerful position, he could do that. And he was charged. He is being prosecuted for it, after the mother of this poor guy who just insisted. And so it just seemed to be so out of hand that it was an entity unto itself. Like, yeah, there are a lot of narco politicians, and the narco politicians are generally the ones, like if you look at the Miroslava breach, the cartel was behind that, but it was because she was exposing the connection between the cartel and people running for office. And that seems to be the third rail, so to speak, in American expression, where if you touch it, that's gets you electrocuted. And so it seemed to me to be that cross of powers and interests that was really most dangerous for the journalists. But also, again, I just wanted to expose the state where, and again, we have other examples now, it's not news anymore, but where the government itself kind of created its own type of criminal organization that crossed a lot of different things. And so, and under that regime was when there was an epidemic of journalist killings in Veracruz, just in one state. It was the worst state in the nation, in one of the, worst places in the world to be a journalist. So I just really felt compelled to explain that phenomenon because, again, I think the outside world didn't, they didn't really get the nuances, and I wanted to just tell that story.
I mean, one of the crazy things, showing this was when there was a leaked phone call which had a federal deputy calling La Tuta and asking him, so calling a federal deputy, a federal member of Congress in Mexico from Michoacan, calling up a drug boss, La Tuta, and saying, there's this journalist I'd like to, he's being annoying, and La Tuta was like, yeah, I can get rid of him, I can take care of him for you. So you kind of really saw that. After that federal deputy went on the run, has been on the run since. I mean, Luis, what do you see? You think, are you more scared in a way of politicians, of narcos, of narco politicians, of soldiers, of Marines, of cops, of mayors, of sicarios, how do you compare the threats, or can we even tell the difference between these different threats?
Yeah, well, I think talking about probably when you can speak free, like freedom of speech, right? Like talking about this, when you censorship, like self-censorship.
Yeah,
I think it's coming way more directly when you go after a politician. As Catherine just said, when Miroslava, I worked briefly for Miroslava in Ciudad Juarez before she was murdered. And I think she was one of the first journalists that kind of like laid out super clear right after she was killed. I remember the Chihuahua State governor, former governor Cesar Duarte, was on the hotspot for corruption, but we had heard a lot of rumors that he was working with the Juarez cartel, that he even had his own code word inside the Juarez cartel, inside La Línea. So when he was on the loose, I did this investigation for Proceso magazine that ended up being the cover of the magazine with the face of Cesar Duarte and all of the properties under his name or his family's names and stuff in Texas. When I was researching the properties, when I was researching his goods on this side of the border, a car showed up outside my house in Ciudad Juarez, right in front of the street, with an armed man. He had a handgun on his lap, and he stayed there for like a week. I remember calling Article 19 to see what should I do. They told me that if that was a possibility for me, I should get across the border and then start a whole protocol of security and stuff. The Miroslava murder was like very, very recent, and so basically the first time I really felt that I was under a threat was when the face of a politician was on the cover of a magazine with a story I had written. I've never felt that way in that sense with a narco, right? It sort of feels that the political power has like more interest in keeping us quiet than the drug traffickers. Sometimes the narcos or these criminal organizations will as we discussed before, want you to be a propaganda machine for them sometimes, right? So they're in their best interest, and sometimes it's not your silence. But it works very differently. It works in the opposite way with politicians. They want your silence. They want you to keep quiet. It has changed, in my point of view. It has changed in the last probably 10 years, 5 years, whereas the politician power, the political power, is using the drug cartels or the criminal organizations on their favor. I think it is a message they want to send through someone if they want to kill you, whatever, or if they want to scare you, they will say like, hey man, they will leak. And I've had calls with several colleagues in places like Quintana Roo, in Veracruz as well, of colleagues calling and discussing how a politician warned them about like a cartel going against them. That was probably not true. and they were just trying to scare him from putting off a story that affected his political group or a friend or a colleague from the same party. So I think that's those nuances are really difficult to tell to a wider audience when they say, like, why are you publishing this story? Why are you covering this? And sometimes it's like, well, I think that's not the right story to tell. And going back a bit on what we talked about earlier, before, I think us as journalists were putting out stories that were setting up an agenda and where people was going to talk about, right? And like, well, these happen according to this story from the AP or from EFE or from Proceso or whoever. But right now, I think social media is setting up its own agenda that sometimes we follow, we need to cover if you don't want to stay behind the information. And that also puts us in a very vulnerable place, because then you need the time to figure out if you're going to be used as propaganda for a criminal group, or if you're going to keep quiet and probably in favor of a political power. So I think the complexity of it all is even stronger on these latest years than it was before in terms of the public accessibility of information.
Yeah, so talking about that political compared to a criminal attack, and they're mixed up, I think, to the point, many of them, you can't tell the difference because you have cartels working with corrupt officials. But you still, the majority of the more than 150 cases, the majority are in states with very, very strong cartel presence, very strong organized crime presence, and very, very many are that we don't hear about as much, but the kind of big numbers are very local reporters covering the crime beat, covering the cop beat. Then you've got some of the very high profile cases like Regina and Maricela working for like bigger, national outlets, and they're more focused on politicized cases. So kind of mix of things there. We're getting down to the last 8 minutes or so, just to kind of, one thing with this, I mean, how good or bad is now, after 20 years of 150 journalists being murdered and way more things beyond that, because you've had like hundreds of journalists who have been in protection, some have fled the country, many have fled their cities and moved around in Mexico. And then also the industry is facing other issues as well, economic issues like everybody. Local newspapers are going down and people are turning to start Facebook pages and do more like social media stuff. But how good do you think, how resilient has Mexican journalism been? And I would start off by saying I think it has been resilient. I mean, it's just incredible, but like, it has not stopped people covering it generally, but there are black holes. So I don't know what do you think, Catherine? How good or bad is the coverage after this, and what can we learn from that, in the United States or whatever, about how Mexican journalism has survived this onslaught of violence?
Well, I agree with you that the coverage has become really incredible in the last 10 to 15 years. What I first saw when I came, and you all know this, that what was really popular and what initially was getting some reporters killed was the Nota Roja, because there was this big market for journalists to run out and, in the past it was car accidents, or it was, domestic violence or something, and it became narco violence. And these reporters would run out and snap photos or get shorts. They were paid for the photos. And so when those reporters started getting killed, and that would be like the more, they say the sensationalist journalism. But when those reporters started getting killed, the publications really pulled back on their, and a lot of publications, I think even today, won't cover the Nota Roja. And so that was one change there. But I think at the same time, the Mexican press, first of all, when all this started, the Mexican press was still coming out of a long era of control and intimidation by the PRI. and the PRI had just been kicked out in 2000. And so the Mexican press was starting to be a real independent press. And I think that has grown tremendously since then in a very good way. And the quality of journalism and investigations in Mexico are quite good. And so I think there's been a real, shall I say, rise in journalism in Mexico. At the same time, you have all these forces trying to beat it down. You have these threats. You have the president every day calling the journalists liars. You have the economic forces that are making it difficult for reporters to do good journalism. But what I see in many cases everywhere is reporters really wanting to play their role of watchdog and speak truth to power, and doing it in the most difficult circumstances. And I think that's what inspires me as a journalist, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the story, and also why I think, you know, Luis, you mentioned a lot, there's a lot more camaraderie now. Initially, there was a lot of distrust among the journalist corps, and now you have camaraderie, you have people working together, you have people supporting each other, you have security protocols, things that didn't exist when this was first happening. And the way I look at it is, you know, we should think in any way we can as a profession to support the work that you're doing, because it really is incredible in the most difficult environment. And so I always say journalism has improved dramatically, while the environment for doing so in Mexico has actually gotten much worse. That's how I would put it.
And just before, to give Luis the last word, but before, what do you think, Catherine, compared to the United States and the issues that the US is going through with free speech and so forth, but what lesson can be learned from Mexico's experience in the United States about facing threats to free speech?
I think there's a really alarming parallel, because we see our politicians now in the United States speaking like AMLO and speaking like, you know, calling us liars, trying to do everything to discredit us. And that's what the Mexican journalists have been up against for a long time. And so we're seeing it. And the alarming thing about it is that it works. It's very effective. And so we now are seeing the tactics that have been used by powers that be in Mexico now being used against us, and a huge campaign to discredit journalists and journalism in the United States. And you see the effects of it. You see actually increased physical attacks on journalists in the United States. You see more blocking of information that you know, before was sort of a given that if we filed a request, we would get it. And now there's all these reasons why we can't get it. So it is alarming to see our situation becoming actually more like Mexico.
Luis, then, okay, so talking about, you know, Mexico and the United States, and you're both, you know, you're reporting in both countries, you know, especially being in the border area, which is a real area for reporting on both sides. And one of the things actually that's crazy that Luis, the night discovered on a recent trip there, is that the failure actually of US regional reporting because of economic resources and the internet and so forth. You know, we were in South Texas, you know, near over the border El Paso area, and there was this amazing trial we were looking at about all these Juarez cartel figures that happened in Texas. We go to the documents, and it hadn't been covered because there was no crime reporters, local reporters looking at this stuff anymore. But anyway, particularly about, you know, Mexico, how optimistic, pessimistic do you feel now about reporting, and how good is it now? And what are the main challenges you see right now going forward with reporting in the face of violence, economics, government, and all these things?
I think there is an issue that needs to be or have a wider audience. We seldom speak about this stuff in the media, and that's making Mexican journalists very vulnerable to everything. It's first of all the economic issue. I mean, the gap between what you get paid only for publishing in English or what you get just by publishing in Spanish in different outlets, it's huge. It's Of course, it has its own natural economics reasons, right? But it's huge. And most of these Mexican journalists working for local news, as you were pointing out, this is happening less and less in the US, making the US press more vulnerable, and probably happening more and more in Mexico. More and more journalists are covering regional or very hyper-local stories, caring for their own communities. And I think that's something super useful, but at the same time, it's making local journalists more vulnerable because they're on their own. They don't have the backing up of, like a big news agency or a big name of a corporation, even though they could be making probably better or a bit more money through donations and through Patreons and all these other ways of making money, is making also Mexican journalists more vulnerable because they're more alone. And again, it starts a competition amongst several independent journalists. Now, on the U.S. side of the border, as we were discussing earlier, this local journalism is basically dying. It's getting bought off by biggest corporations that just basically care for the generalities of a region, right? They cover like the news that impact probably nationwide. When you're in the border, it's weird because you cover things that, for the most part, you feel they are regional or of a local importance. Getting to the beginning of the conversation when Catherine was speaking about how this story about a decapitated body inside the morgue in Ciudad Juarez was telling the whole story of what was happening in this region. Back then, I wrote this story about all the stray dogs in Ciudad Juarez, that many of them were from families that were either displaced or people that got murdered. And seeing dogs out in the street without an owner was a consequence of what was happening in a city like Juarez. And I feel like that a lot of the times. I get assignments that are going to have an impact in the US or in Mexico or in both countries that I feel very, very local, very unique to my regional or local community. But again, I have the benefit that I can get the news on both languages. I can pitch to a Mexican news outlet or a US-based audience, which is probably has more reach. I think one of the challenges is, how do we put these two communities together and make them form a single community, like what happened in Juarez before, at the beginning of the spike in violence in the city, when we started working as colleagues and taking care from each other, and getting more attention as a group and not as a single individual. I think we're facing again a challenge, probably a different challenge, but also a huge challenge both countries. We have AMLO on one side, pointing out to Mexican journalism, trying to discredit their very good coverage, but also politicians in the US trying to do the same thing. And sometimes when a Mexican journalist covers a story and then it gets picked up by a US based language outlet, but doesn't give the credit of this investigation, that makes this guy vulnerable, because that is taking him out of the spot that could probably get protection from, right? So I think the challenge is, how do we make a community, a camaraderie between US and Mexican outlets, and probably amplifying more both of our coverage, both of our news, and make ourselves like stronger. In the US, we have a lot of like resources from the open source world, a lot of like databases and stuff that we don't have in Mexico. But then in Mexico, we have a lot of other opportunities to better cover these stories. So I think that's a major challenge that is going to be in benefit of the freedom of speech in both countries.
I think well, let's say, and with that call for peace and unity, which is always good, although it's not just between Mexico and the United States. I mean, in the United States, people will be familiar with a lot of journalists who hate each other and are trying to take each other out.
Yeah.
And that's the same in Mexico. And in Mexico, actually, there's a lot of when I was involved in some of the kind of campaigns following the death of journalist Javier Valdez, an amazing colleague murdered in 2017, and we were kind of putting stuff together. And I was working with people like Temoris Greco and putting out statements and marching and so forth. And there was like, why are certain journalists not here? Or, you know, you only get a certain group, but then, you know, we don't communicate. And the big stars in Mexico who have the TV shows and have the resources aren't really getting involved in a lot of conflict. So anyway, that last, that kind of unity among journalists, definitely, I mean, it's a very hard thing, and respect and unity among ourselves could help. Respecting free speech as part of it to have. So anyway, well, that's hopes there, tough challenges and hopes, and what Mexican journalism can teach English language journalism about that. So great stuff there.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And Luis, I couldn't agree with you more about us working together more. I am going to sign off. Thank you again so much for the invitation. And
yep. We're all done. Come and I think they have links to our work, and you can check it out. Catherine Corcoran, Luis Chaparro, and Joan Grillo. So thanks so much.